The communist regime's influence on the United Nations isn't limited to the WHO. In an interview on Fox News, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro said China is trying to control almost every organization within the United Nations. He said over the last decade, China has been aggressively pursuing control of those organizations by getting people elected to top positions. The United Nations has 15 specialized agencies, and Chinese nationals head 4 of them. The WHO's previous Director General is also a Chinese national. Inside the UN's principal organs, Chinese nationals are also taking up lead positions, like the Vice President of the International Court of Justice, who's also a former Chinese ambassador. The communist regime's efforts to grow its influence in the UN have been years in the making. Over 70 years ago, when it seized control of the mainland, Taiwan represented China in the United Nations. After losing the Civil War in the 1940s, China's legitimate government at the time retreated to Taiwan. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party established the current regime on the mainland. A question emerged: who should represent China in the United Nations? With support from the United States, Taiwan maintained its seat in the UN for more than 2 decades. But the tables were turned when the U.S. decided to get closer to China. The turning point came on July 15, 1971, when President Nixon announced his visit to Communist China the following year. On the same day, the communist regime's allies ramped up their efforts to replace Taiwan. They called for the region to take its place, saying Taiwan's position was unlawful. A resolution was later introduced and passed. Of the UN members, over 95% of European countries and over 60% of African countries voted for it. 2 days later, Chiang Kai-shek, then president of Taiwan, officially announced Taiwan's withdrawal from the UN. Chiang wrote, "The United Nations that my country helped form is now a hotbed of evil, and history will prove that the Republic of China's declaration of withdrawal will also be the declaration of the destruction of the United Nations." Today, the Chinese Communist regime's influence on the United Nations is evident. One telling example, China's controversial Belt and Road Initiative. Top UN officials have consistently praised this signature project.
The Belt and Road Initiative has immense potential. Running through Asia, Europe and Africa, and extended to the whole world, it is far-reaching in geography and in ambition.
But it also provides an opportunity for people to see how we can truly unlock those trillions for investments that make sense, because they bring people together, they empower young people, but more especially give jobs to all.
The UN support comes at a time when Beijing is facing growing criticism for overburdening nations with debt and undercutting their sovereignty with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Chinese investment does have the potential to address Africa's infrastructure gap, but its approach has led to mounting debt and few, if any, jobs in most countries. When coupled with the political and fiscal pressure, this endangers Africa's natural resources and its long-term economic political stability.
Beijing funded infrastructure projects in developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. Some countries wound up saddled with debt. When they can't repay the loans, Beijing seizes their key assets. Critics call China's lending practices debt diplomacy. China rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Within 6 years, over 150 countries and organizations had come on board. A Chinese consul general says the UN's strong support has contributed to the project's success. Chinese nationals working in key positions in the UN have played a part in this. In 2016, China signed a deal with the UN promising to pour $20 million into its Peace and Development Fund every year for 10 years. Under the terms, the fund has a steering committee which advises the UN Secretary General on projects. 4 of the 5 members are Chinese nationals. One of them is China's Foreign Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs. He now heads the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or DESA. After the fund was established, China asked DESA to do a study looking at how the Belt and Road Initiative could help with the UN's development goals. A top economist at DESA conducted the study. He also happens to be a Chinese national. The economist arrived at a favorable conclusion. His report says the spirit of the Belt and Road Initiative, quote, is to a large extent in line with that of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. China has been successful at planting its delegates inside the UN. Media reports suggest Beijing was able to do this by leveraging its relationship with Africa. In 2019, China's deputy agricultural minister was elected as the head of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. He won by a comfortable margin. Over half of the member states voted for him. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization is critical for global food security and agricultural industries. It sets international standards for food and animal safety. French media reports Beijing spent more than $200 million on erasing debt for some African countries and ramping up donations in exchanges for votes. 2 months after, China forgave more than $70 million of debt to Cameroon, a country in Central Africa. Its candidate announced he was quitting the race. China also erased large amounts of debt for other African countries, the Congo, Zambia, Madagascar, and the list continues. The report says China asked its allies to snap a photo of their ballot in the voting booth for evidence of their choice before releasing the funds. The French delegation tried to stop representatives from bringing their phones to the booth, but China and its allies opposed. China holds significant leverage over Africa via its debt. 10 years ago, Africa owed minimal debt to China. Today, Beijing is the largest creditor to Africa. Countries on the continent owe China more than $140 billion. Africa expert David Shin says China is interested in Africa in part because of the political support it can provide in the United Nations. When it comes to voting in UN specialized agencies, numbers count. 54 African countries means 54 votes. In an interview with China Knowledge, Shin said if China has the support of most of the African countries, then it has a big block of votes for defending its position, particularly in a place like the UN's Human Rights Council. 2 years ago, the United States withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council.
For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers.
Haley said countries that perpetrate human rights abuses continue to be elected to the council, such as the Congo, and the world's most inhumane regimes continue to escape scrutiny.
Therefore, as we said we would do a year ago, if we did not see any progress, the United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
The communist regime has long been criticized for its human rights violations, and its influence inside the UN continues to expand. This April, China was appointed to the Human Rights Council panel. This gives China the power to choose human rights investigators, those who monitor freedom of speech, enforce disappearances, and arbitrary detention. All of these are rights the communist regime violates. Hillel Neuer, executive director of a UN watchdog group, says the UN's move is absurd and immoral. He tweeted, "That's like making a pyromaniac into the town fire chief." Inside the UN sprawling system, Chinese nationals are not limited to principal organs in key international organizations. Over 20 Chinese nationals hold leadership positions in other UN funds and programs, other entities, and international trade and financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and World Bank.